the question of what the World Bank does is a very broad one, but let's say that the World Bank promotes poverty reduction in its client countries. Now, we do that with a mix of financial assistance by lending money to those countries and knowledge assistance, where we provide assistance in terms of knowledge, best practice, global experience, in order that countries can undertake the necessary reforms. There is no area that I would say absolutely should not be privatized. It depends very much on the circumstances. There are gradations. I would say that water and electricity are maybe more amenable to privatization than health and education. But that doesn't mean that I would rule out privatization for health and education, nor will I always advocate privatization for water and electricity.
The Washington Consensus was a consensus between the U.S. Treasury, the IMF, the World Bank, three Washington institutions, about what was the best strategy for economic development. It argued that the best way for countries to grow was to liberalize, reduce trade barriers, and to privatize. And over the years, the IMF, the World Bank, the U.S. Treasury, all pushed this doctrine of privatization on developing countries. The IMF and the World Bank gave a set of loans, particularly in the 80s, that were called structural adjustment. The theory behind it was that the economies needed some assistance as they went through the adjustment of the structure to liberalize and to privatize. But the problem with them was that there were very strong conditions imposed. Countries were told to get this money, they often had to cut out education or health or other expenditures that were really quite vital. Enormous cost to many of the developing countries.
ESCOM, they cut it off because I'm not working. They cut it off. I've got no money to pay electricity. They cut it off.
So, phila nganje bongasebenza.
Phila ngokuhola.
Uqaleni manje uhola? Roughly nje finance.
Ngiyabona 2 years ngihola.
2 years uhola. But yakwazi ukuthi kuphilise lokho.
Yeah, ngoba ngiyakhona ukuthi ngithele parafini, njengamalahle, ngithenga ukudla. But la matikiti soda ngisozola ukuthi singaba phela. Okay. Yeah, let's go.
Cheers. Kodwa umgolota malini 7,956. And but I was on a case for 2 years.
For 2 years, my
But I was like 2 million statement.
So I'm going to open this pillar box so that I can show what is going on here. Some of the customers, they don't pay. So ESCOM send the contractors to do the disconnections. Because what we are saying, sometimes we just remove the circuit breaker and cut the wire for that special customer that is not paying. They don't pay, some they say they don't have money to pay. So they'll be having the excuses that they are not working, they are only depending to those guys who are getting the pension. That's it.
Our forefathers, to put it twice dramatically, they handed the railway to us so that we could hand it on as part of a common service. But no, it's just being stripped, raped even.
Another disaster on the main line out of West London, even before the last one has finished being investigated. 2 trains...
If the fears of the police and fire crews are realised, this will be Britain's worst ever rail disaster.
2 trains collided at the height of the morning rush hour. Hundreds of people found their journey to work had turned into a nightmare.
He's prevented another blow to confidence in railway safety.
There would have been 3 rail accidents which could be directly attributed to privatisation or the process running up to privatisation. There were failures in all 3. These things had been pointed out prior to the accident. If they had been addressed, then the accident would not have happened. But all these things cost money. And because of the need for the private companies to be more efficient and save money, to make profit for the shareholders, these things were never carried out.
I'm Mr. Delphine Soriano Jr. I'm one of the clinical instructor here in Quirino Memorial Medical Center. This is one of the premier hospitals in the Philippines who is catering for training and education and also research for the Philippine patients. So as the moment, the flight of nurses to the Philippines is quite bad because of the several of Filipino nurses go abroad, primarily because of they want to gain financial stability and they could not gain that here in the Philippines. One primary reason, or big reason, is that the allotted budget of the government is not enough. The health budget is being cut because it is realigned to budget for national defense, for payment of our loan in the World Bank. No? So we're just paying our interest for the World Bank. No? I'm not a politics, but the thing is, what I feel, no, the burden of seeing these patients suffering, wherein some of the politicians, some of the businessmen gaining wealth, they have all the resources, but these patients are there. Patay, kumusta na? Just like this one. One patient is under intubation with ongoing amoebagging. Is placed under cardiac monitor, and really patient is really in critical condition. This is an example of how the situation of Filipino people just placed in the government institution, because this patient is really needs intensive care should be placed in a certain ventilator because only relative could provide for 24 hours is ambubag. If this relative would fail to do the ambubagging, the patient will die. So what is the deficit here? The resources, the ventilator and other devices, which the institution could not provide because the patient need to pay. The patient would pay. They have to pay the ventilator. Privatization aggravates the access of poor people to health service, particularly health service. This is a very, very obvious example.
Sí, el Banco Mundial condicionaba al gobierno boliviano una cierta cantidad de préstamos a cambio de que el gobierno privatice el agua en Cochabamba. Quisieron convertir el agua en una mercancía, quisieron quitar a los seres vivos de un recurso tan vital para la existencia. A la semana de la firma del contrato con la empresa Agua del Tunari, las tarifas de agua aumentaban entre un 30 y un 300%. Quiere decir que cada familia en Cochabamba tenía que destinar 25% de sus ingresos solo para pagar el agua. Se eliminaban también las fuentes de agua que eran propiedades de los campesinos, y esta propiedad colectiva de las fuentes de agua, denominado usos y costumbres, pasaban a propiedad de las empresas mediante un mercado de aguas. Y finalmente la ley, muy sutilmente, muy entre líneas, indicaba que estaba prohibido acumular agua de la lluvia. Por lo tanto, el agua de la lluvia también, de manera muy disimulada, estaba privatizada.
In water, in electricity, and in some aspects of transport, there's been a substantial shift towards the private sector. I don't think that has much to do with the World Bank. It has to do much more with technological considerations and a general environment of people have been seeing successes in around the world. There are a couple of responses to why the critics are saying that the World Bank is always pushing privatization. One is, I think critics will, by definition, always find something to blame the World Bank for. I think that some of these critics just as much will oppose any kind of privatization, whether or not it helps poor people. And we have to be aware of that as well, that there are some privatizations that actually help poor people. And we will unashamedly support those, and we will defend those, even though our critics will say, oh, the World Bank is pushing privatization.
Good evening, I'm Ian McFadden, and you're watching Inside Money. Tonight we're looking at problems in Ruritania. Located far away on the other side of the globe, it's easy to think of Ruritania as an idyllic and beautiful place to live. But the lovely countryside stands in sharp contrast to the problems brewing in the country's capital. The government spends money wastefully, employing more people than it needs. It does provide some essential social benefits, but it also hands out subsidies to people who don't need them. Ruritania could simply go into arrears, that is, simply not pay its bills to foreigners. But none of these is a long-term solution. If Ruritania does nothing, its economic engine will grind to a halt. The good news is that Ruritania has consulted the IMF and developed an economic reform plan. At this point, maybe we should find out a little more about the IMF. Here's our economics correspondent, Iris Marie Fay. Iris?
Thanks, Ian. The various reform plans usually involve encouraging growth and opening the economy to outside trade, and taking away trade barriers that unduly protect local industry, stifling innovation and efficiency. And some inefficient state-owned industries may be privatized. It can be painful, but a country in this position really does have to tighten its belt.
Thanks, Iris Marie. The final result of all this effort and attention should be an improvement in the foundations of Ruritania's economy, and that will make life better for Ruritanians. This is Ruritania, well on its way to being a strong member of the global economy. Thanks for watching, and good night.
Good night.